The sun was a hammer over the Arizona territory, beating the dust of the Butterfield Overland Trail into a fine, choking powder. It was 1876, a year of centennial celebrations back east, and a year of merciless drought out west. The sky was not blue but a pale, searing sheet of copper, and the air that moved through the stagecoach's open windows tasted of baked earth and distant thunder that never came. From her corner seat, Margaret Hale, known to most as Maggie, watched the landscape shimmer. Mesquite and saguaro stood like skeletal sentinels in a land that seemed to have forgotten the color green. At 26, Maggie was a widow, a fact that had stripped life of its softer edges and left a core of practical, unyielding steel. Her husband, a good man with hands calloused from hard work and a mind full of geological charts, had been lost to a silver mine collapse the year before. The official report called it an accident. Maggie called it a loose thread she had not yet found the end of. Now, she made her way as a mobile telegraph operator and part-time tutor, a life that suited her independent spirit. She was headed for Redemption Gulch, a raw little town clinging to the promise of the new railroad line, a place where a woman with a quick mind and faster fingers on a telegraph key could earn her keep. The coach lurched, its iron-shod wheels finding another rut in the baked adobe. Across from her, a young Mexican couple huddled together, their faces etched with the anxiety of the journey, their small son asleep between them, his head pillowed on his mother's lap. The only other passenger was a portly salesman of patent medicines, who had long since sweated through his collar and exhausted his supply of folksy anecdotes. He snored softly, his mouth agape. Maggie's gaze drifted past them, out toward the distant, hazy shapes of the Chiricahua Mountains. Apache Pass was out there, a place spoken of in whispers, a place of ambush and ghosts. Far beyond it lay the angular silhouette of Fort Bowie, a lonely outpost of federal authority in a territory that largely governed itself with gunpowder and grit. The stories traveled faster than any stagecoach, carried on the wind and embellished in every saloon and trading post. The Apache, they said, were a constant, merciless threat, raiders born of the desert's cruelty. She felt the familiar tension in her shoulders. She had heard the tales, seen the fearful glances of settlers. Yet, something in her resisted the simple, brutal narrative. Truth, she had learned, was rarely so straightforward. It was more often a tangled knot, like the wires of a telegraph line after a storm. The world outside the window exploded. It was not a single sound, but a violent symphony. The crack of rifles, the splintering of wood, and a chorus of high, ululating cries that seemed to claw at the air. The coach driver's shout was cut short. The salesman jolted awake with a squeal, his eyes wide with uncomprehending terror. The horses screamed, a sound of pure animal panic, and the coach slewed sideways, throwing Maggie hard against the wall. The Mexican woman clutched her child, murmuring prayers in a desperate torrent of Spanish. Through the dust and smoke, figures on horseback materialized like demons from the heat haze. They were painted and feathered, their bare chests streaked with red ochre, their movements fluid and terrifying. They swarmed the crippled coach, their faces contorted in what looked like savage glee. An attacker wrenched the door open, his eyes landing on the salesman's valise. He yanked it free, the bottles of tonic clinking inside. Maggie pressed herself into the corner, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. This was it, the stories made real, everything she had been warned about, a maelstrom of violence under the furnace sky. She watched as one of the raiders grabbed the Mexican man, pulling him from the coach and throwing him to the ground. Another went for the woman, his hand reaching for the simple silver crucifix at her neck. But amidst the chaos, her operator's mind, trained to see patterns and details, snagged on an inconsistency. Something was wrong. The movements, while violent, felt theatrical. The cries, while loud, lacked a certain resonance she could not name. It was a performance. Then she saw it. One of the raiders, leaning down to cut a leather pouch from the driver's belt, stumbled over a loose rock. His coarse linen bandana, tied to cover his lower face, slipped for a single, frozen second. Maggie saw not the high cheekbones and copper skin of an Apache warrior, but a pale, sunburnt jawline covered in rough stubble. A shock of sweat-slicked blonde hair fell across his brow, and as he righted himself, a wave of air carried a scent that cut through the dust and gunpowder, the sour, unmistakable reek of cheap corn liquor. It was a detail so jarring, so utterly out of place, that it momentarily silenced the fear in her mind. Blonde hair, whiskey, it was a lie. This whole attack was a lie. The Mexican woman's scream brought her back. Her son, jolted from her arms in the struggle, had tumbled to the ground and rolled partially beneath the heavy, angled wheel of the coach. He was trapped, his small leg pinned beneath the massive weight. The mother fought with the ferocity of a lioness, but the raider shoved her back, laughing. Suddenly, a new figure appeared at the edge of the fray. He was not one of them. He rode a powerful black horse that stood still as a statue amidst the chaos, and he himself was a study in stillness. He wore simple buckskin trousers and a linen shirt, his long black hair held back by a leather band. He carried no paint, only the deep tan of a life lived under the sun. There were lines of experience etched around his eyes, and a quiet authority in the set of his shoulders. His face was unreadable, but his presence was a physical force, a sudden silence in the heart of the noise. The fake raiders saw him. Their laughter died. They exchanged nervous glances, their theatrical rage deflating into common thuggery. The man on the black horse said nothing. He simply watched, his gaze moving from one painted face to another. It was enough. With muttered curses, they scrambled back onto their ponies. One of them, the blonde one, shot a final, hateful look toward the silent observer before kicking his horse into a gallop. In moments, they were gone, melting back into the shimmering heat from which they had come. The silence they left behind was profound, broken only by the whimpering of the trapped child and the ragged breathing of the survivors. The stranger dismounted. He moved not with the swagger of a gunslinger, but with a deliberate, ground-covering grace. He ignored the cowering salesman and the shaken couple. His focus was entirely on the small boy pinned beneath the wheel. He knelt, his voice low and calm as he spoke a few words in a language Maggie did not recognize. But the tone was universal. It was the sound of reassurance. The boy's mother, her face streaked with tears and dust, watched with a mixture of hope and terror. The father started to rise, to help, but the stranger simply held up a hand, a gesture not of command, but of quiet competence. He placed his hands on the thick, wooden spokes of the wheel, settled his feet in the dirt, and braced his shoulders. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a slow, controlled surge of power that seemed impossible for one man, he lifted. Muscles corded in his back and arms. The wood groaned in protest, and the massive wheel rose just enough. The father scrambled forward, pulling his crying son free. The stranger lowered the coach gently back to the ground. He stood, his breathing even, and looked at the boy, who was now safely in his mother's arms, his leg bruised but not broken. A flicker of something, perhaps satisfaction, crossed the man's stoic features before vanishing. His dark eyes finally came to rest on Maggie. She was standing now, her hand resting on the splintered frame of the coach, her mind racing to reconcile the man from the stories with the man standing before her. They were two different beings, the monster of rumor and the savior of a child. He walked toward her. Instinct, honed by a year of solitude and a lifetime of cautionary tales, screamed at her to run, to fear him, but her eyes told a different story. She had seen him stop the violence, not start it. She had seen him show compassion, and most of all, she had seen the blonde-haired, whiskey-scented man flee from his silent gaze. "They cut the wires," she said, her voice raspy with dust. It was the first thing that came to her practical mind. The telegraph line, Her connection to the world, to order and reason, was severed. She could see the dangling copper strand glinting in the sun 100 yards down the trail. It had been a deliberate act. The man nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the scene of the attack, then the direction the fake raiders had fled. "They cut many things," he said. His voice was a low baritone, calm and measured. "Truth is the easiest." He looked back at her, his gaze intense, analytical. "They will be back," he said, not referring to the attackers. "A posse from the fort or the town. They will see this, and they will see me. They will not ask questions." Maggie understood. They would find an Apache man at the scene of an Apache raid, and the story would write itself. The lie would be sealed in blood. Her blood, too, most likely. An inconvenient witness. "You must come with me," he said. It was not a question. Her mind reeled. Go with him, an Apache chief, for he could be nothing less. Into the wilderness, every instinct for self-preservation warred with the evidence of her own senses. She thought of the blonde hair, the smell of liquor. She thought of the child, safe in his mother's arms. The stories were afire, burning hot and fast, but what she had seen was a single, stubborn fact that refused to be consumed. "I am not your prisoner," she stated, her chin lifting. It was a foolish thing to say, a weak assertion of control where she had none, but she had to say it. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. "I have no need for prisoners, only for the truth. And right now, the truth needs a safe place to hide, as do you." He gestured with his head toward a narrow, almost invisible break in the distant rock formations. "A canyon. There is water there, and safety, for a time." He turned to the Mexican family, speaking to them in quiet, fluent Spanish. He pointed them back down the trail, toward a trading post they had passed miles back, telling them to travel fast and speak to no one of what they had seen, only that they were robbed. The father nodded, his face filled with a profound, bewildered gratitude. He cast a look at his son, then at the man who had saved him, and then herded his family away. Now it was just Maggie and the Apache leader. The sun beat down. The silence of the desert pressed in. She looked at his outstretched hand. It was not a threat. It was an offer, an impossible choice. To stay was to be consumed by the lie. To go was to step into a world she knew nothing about, guided by a man she was supposed to fear above all others. He saw the conflict in her eyes. "My name is Nantan Lobo," he said simply, as if offering a common courtesy. She made her decision. It was not a surrender, but a conscious choice to trust what she had seen over what she had been told. She let out a slow breath. "You don't take talkative prisoners, do you?" she asked, her voice dry, a sliver of her usual wit returning as a shield. Nantan Lobo's gaze held hers. He did not smile, but the severity in his eyes lessened, only when they tell too many lies. He turned and walked toward his horse. Maggie took one last look at the ruined coach, the severed wire, and the hot, empty trail. Then, with her heart still pounding a nervous rhythm, she followed him toward the mouth of the canyon, leaving the simple, dangerous story behind for a complicated and uncertain truth. The entrance to the canyon was a whisper of a crack in a sheer rock wall, a place one could ride past 100 times and never see. Nantan Lobo led the way, his black horse navigating the narrow, twisting path with an uncanny sureness. For Maggie, it felt like passing through a veil into another world. The scorching heat of the open desert receded, replaced by the cool, stone-scented air of the shadows. The sky was reduced to a brilliant blue ribbon far above them. After several minutes, the passage opened into a hidden bowl, a secret oasis shielded from the world by towering walls of red rock. It was not a large settlement, just a handful of brush wickiups and hide lean-tos arranged in a comfortable, organic way. A small herd of ponies grazed in a patch of surprisingly green grass, and the low murmur of voices mixed with the sound of a child's laughter. The air smelled of juniper smoke, roasting meat, and damp earth. This was not the savage war camp of popular imagination. It was a home. The source of the life was immediately apparent. From a fissure in the rock face, a steady stream of clear, cold water trickled down over moss-slicked stones into a deep, quiet pool. It was an underground spring, a secret artery of the desert. The water, Maggie thought, was like the truth Nantan had spoken of, flowing pure and hidden beneath a surface of baked lies. A woman emerged from one of the wiki-ups, wiping her hands on a leather apron. She was taller than Maggie expected, with the same strong, high cheekbones as Nantan and a long, thick braid of black hair that fell over her shoulder. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, held a calm authority. She looked at Maggie not with hostility, but with a deep, searching curiosity. "Nali Awan," Nantan said by way of introduction. "My sister." Nali's gaze flickered from Maggie to her brother, a silent conversation passing between them. Then she nodded and came forward. She took Maggie's arm gently, her touch surprisingly soft, and examined a long scrape on her forearm from the stagecoach crash. Without a word, she led Maggie to a shaded spot near the pool and returned a moment later with a damp cloth and a small clay pot of greenish salve. As she cleaned the wound, her movements were efficient and practiced. The salve, smelling of pine and something else, something wild and clean, was instantly soothing. The days that followed fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the practical needs of survival. There was no idleness here. Maggie watched as Nali mended a torn saddle blanket, her all-and-sinew thread moving with a speed and precision that Maggie, with her own skill in fine needlework, could deeply appreciate. She learned that the world was full of signs she had never known how to read. Nantan showed her how to identify the tracks of a coyote versus a stray dog, how the droop of a certain plant's leaves in the afternoon could signal water deep beneath the soil. He took a knife to the top of a barrel cactus and showed her the watery pulp inside, a bitter but life-saving drink. This quiet, purposeful existence was a stark contrast to the frantic energy of the towns she knew, and it gave her mind too much space to wander. In the cool of the evenings, as she sat watching the stars appear in the ribbon of sky overhead, the image of her husband, William, would rise unbidden. She remembered his hands, always stained with rock dust, and the way he would spread his maps on their small kitchen table, his finger tracing the veins of silver ore he was so certain would make their fortune. She remembered the day the foreman from the Baines Mining Company had come to their door, his hat in his hands and his face a mask of rehearsed sympathy. A terrible accident, he had said. A support timber gave way. Nothing anyone could have done. She had believed him. In the fog of her grief, she had accepted the story, packed her few belongings, and left the town, unable to bear the sight of the mine that had taken him. But now, in this canyon of secrets, the memory felt different. It felt like the stagecoach attack, a story too simple, too neat. The name Baines was a phantom, a whisper connected to the worst day of her life, but she had never had a reason to question it. Now, questions were all she had. Nantan seemed to feel the weight of her thoughts. He was a man of few words, but he was a keen observer. He watched her when she fell silent, her gaze lost in the crackling flames of the cook fire. He seemed to understand that her wound was deeper than the scrape on her arm. He, too, bore a heavy silence. Maggie would sometimes see him standing on a high ledge, looking out over the desert, his silhouette a lonely figure against the vast, indifferent landscape. She wondered what he saw out there. Passes, the dust trails of freight wagons pushing ever deeper into his people's land. She was beginning to understand the impossible position he was in. He was a leader trying to protect his people from a world that had already cast them as the villains in its story. How could he fight for justice when every act of defense was labeled savagery? Every tragedy in the territory laid at his door. The weight of that injustice settled in his eyes, a permanent shadow. On the third day, The sky began to change. The brilliant blue bled to a sickly yellow-brown, and the wind, which had been a gentle breath through the canyon, began to moan, then howl. Nolly squinted at the sky, sniffed the air, and began methodically securing the hides on her wickiup. "The sand comes," she said simply. The sandstorm descended not as a weather event, but as a living entity. It was a roaring, scouring beast that devoured the sky and turned the day to a suffocating twilight. The air became thick, a tangible thing that filled the mouth and stung the eyes. Maggie huddled inside the small wickiup with Nolly and 2 young children, the wind screaming outside like a legion of ghosts. Through it all, there was no panic. Nolly told the children a story in her low, musical voice, her hands never ceasing their work as she braided a new cord from yucca fiber. This was a part of their life, a storm to be endured, not feared. They bent with the wind. They did not break. The storm raged for hours. When it finally passed, it left a world remade, every surface coated in a fine layer of red dust, the air strangely still and clean. The next morning, Nolly sat outside, patiently teaching one of the boys how to fletch a small arrow for a toy bow. Maggie watched, fascinated by the intricate work. Noticing her interest, Nolly picked up a seasoned branch of mulberry wood and a knife. "A weapon is a heavy thing to carry," she said, her eyes on her work. "But sometimes the world does not give you a choice." She began to shave the wood, her strokes long and even. She was making a small, sturdy bow. "I am a terrible shot," Maggie admitted, a rueful smile touching her lips. Nolly glanced up, her expression serious but not unkind. "Terrible is an honest beginning," she replied. She held the half-finished bow out to Maggie. "It is better to know how to use this and never need it, than to need it and not know." The simple gift was more than wood and string. It was an acknowledgement, a granting of agency. Nolly saw her not as a helpless outsider, but as someone capable of learning, of defending herself. Later that day, she found Nantan by the spring, sharpening his knife on a smooth, wet stone. The oppressive heat had returned, but here in the shade, it was bearable. The silence stretched between them, comfortable now, not strained. "You are thinking of your husband," he said. It was a statement, not a question. Maggie was startled, but she did not deny it. She nodded, her throat tight. His name was William. He was a geologist. He died in a mining accident last year. The words sounded hollow, a story she had repeated until it had lost its meaning. "He worked for the Baines mine," she added, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. Nantan stopped his work, his hands still. He did not look at her, but his focus had shifted. He was listening with an intensity that made her feel as though she were the only person in the world. "Loss is a stone that is always with you," he said, his voice low. "You learn to carry it. You build around it." He touched a thin, faded scar that ran along his jawline. "This was a gift from a fight to protect my brother. I won the fight, but I lost my brother to the coughing sickness a winter later. The scar is a reminder that some battles cannot be won with a knife." He had offered a piece of his own pain, a quiet act of trust that undid a knot of loneliness deep inside her. He saw her grief, not as a woman's weakness, but as a human truth, one he understood intimately. The chasm between their 2 worlds, the Chiricahua chief and the telegraph operator from Ohio, seemed to shrink in that shared moment of sorrow. And with that clarity came a new resolve. She looked around the small, peaceful camp, at Nolly teaching the children, at the ponies grazing by the life-giving spring. The lie about the stagecoach attack was not just a lie about Nantan. It was a lie that would be used to justify destroying this place. These people, the blonde-haired man and his whiskey breath, were not random bandits. They were a symptom of a sickness, a greed that would burn this entire world down for a few acres of dirt or a vein of silver. She could not stay here. Hiding was not enough. The truth was not a passive thing to be protected. It was a weapon that had to be wielded. She stood up, brushing the red dust from her skirt. Nantan looked up at her, his dark eyes questioning. "I have to go back," she said, her voice clear and steady, surprising even herself with its strength. "I have to go to Redemption Gulch. Someone has to tell them. Someone has to tell them the raiders who attacked the coach were not Apache." Nantan Lobo did not leave her. He escorted her through the winding canyons and hidden arroyos, a silent, watchful presence at her side. He brought her to a ridge overlooking the dusty smear that was Redemption Gulch, the setting sun painting the raw lumber of its buildings in shades of blood and rust. From this vantage point, the town looked like a wound on the landscape. "They will not listen," he said, his voice a low murmur that barely disturbed the evening air. "Words are wind against a wall of belief." "Wind can wear down stone, given enough time," Maggie countered, adjusting the small parcel of dried meat and a water skin that Nolly had pressed into her hands. "And I do not have time. The truth needs a voice right now." He looked at her, and in his gaze she saw a deep, weary understanding of the world she was about to enter. He saw the wall of belief she would face, because he had spent his life on the other side of it. He gave a single, slow nod. "Stay away from the shadows," he advised. And then he was gone, melting back into the landscape as if he were a part of it, leaving her alone with the coming night and the angry glow of the town below. She walked the last mile as twilight bled into darkness, the sounds of Redemption Gulch growing louder with every step. It was the noise of a town trying to convince itself of its own importance, the tinny plink of a piano from a saloon, the raucous laughter of men, the bark of a stray dog. But underneath it all, there was a different sound, a low, angry hum, like a hornet's nest about to be kicked. The first thing she saw as she entered the main street was the noose. It hung from a crossbeam of a half-finished hotel, a stark and ugly silhouette against the last of the light. The rope was thick and new. It was not a remnant of some past justice. It was a promise of a future one. It was a statement. The sight of it sent a cold dread through her that had nothing to do with the evening chill. Justice here was not blind. It was impatient and hungry. She made her way to the livery, the only place to secure a room without entering the boisterous saloon. The stablemaster, a man with watery eyes and a sour disposition, barely glanced at her. He was far more interested in the knot of men gathered outside the swinging doors of the Redemption Saloon next door. Their voices were loud, slurring together in a stew of outrage and whiskey. After securing a small, airless room above the stables, Maggie knew she could not wait. The lie was spreading like a fever, and she was the only cure. Taking a deep breath, she walked out of the livery and pushed through those swinging doors. The saloon went quiet. The piano player's hands froze over the keys. Every head turned. Smoke and the smell of stale beer hung in the air. A dozen pairs of eyes fixed on her, the lone woman in a sea of dusty, angry men. At the center of the room, leaning against the bar with a proprietary air, was a man with a tin star pinned to his vest. He was thick-set, with a florid face and small, cunning eyes that took in her dusty dress and weary expression. This had to be Sheriff Josiah Pike. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," Pike said, his voice a gravelly boom. "We heard you was taken by the savages. Or worse." He let the insinuation hang in the air. "I was not taken," Maggie said, her voice clear and carrying in the sudden silence. "The coach was attacked. The driver was killed. But it was not who you think." Pike pushed himself off the bar, a smirk playing on his lips. He was enjoying this. Performing for his audience. "Is that so? And how would you know, ma'am, seeing as you was probably too busy screaming and fainting?" A few men snickered. Maggie's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She held the sheriff's gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "I was busy watching. The men who attacked us were disguised. They were white men." A murmur went through the crowd. Disbelief, scorn, a few flickers of uncertainty. Pike laughed out loud. "A harsh, barking sound. White men, ma'am. You must have taken a knock to the head. We found the scene. All the signs of an Apache raid. They even burned the telegraph station down the line. Killed the operator. It's their way. Murder and destruction." "They cut the lines," Maggie shot back. "And they did not burn the station to the ground. They disabled the equipment. Carefully. Does that sound like a savage raid to you?" "It sounds like you're confused," Pike said, his voice hardening. The smirk was gone, replaced by a dangerous glint in his eyes. "Maybe that Apache devil, Nantan Lobo, filled your head with stories after he took you. We know he's out there, and when we find him, he'll get a chance to get his story straight at the end of that rope out there." He gestured toward the street, toward the hanging noose, and the crowd's angry hum returned, louder this time. "Hang him!" someone shouted from the back. "Hang them all!" Maggie felt a surge of cold fury. This was not a search for truth. It was a hunt, and the quarry had already been chosen. She took a step forward, her voice ringing with a conviction she did not know she possessed. "The man who ripped the door off the coach, the man who smelled of cheap liquor. He had his bandana slip. I saw him. He had blonde hair and blue eyes." She swept her gaze across the silent, watching faces of the men in the room. "Do any of you have blonde hair and blue eyes?" The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, broken only by the buzzing of a fly against a dirty window pane. Every man seemed to shrink into himself, looking at his neighbor, then at the floor. For one breathtaking moment, her words, her single, hard fact, had broken through the wall of belief. Then the moment shattered. A man slammed his glass on the bar. "She's lying. She's an Indian lover." The room erupted. The accusations flew, ugly and sharp. Pike stepped toward her, his face a mask of fury. He was losing control of the narrative, and it enraged him. "You'll watch your mouth. Ma'am, spoutin' lies like that can get a person in a whole heap of trouble in this town." Suddenly, a woman's shriek cut through the din, coming from the street outside. It was a sound of pure panic. The angry clamor in the saloon faltered as men turned toward the doors. Another cry, a child's voice this time, thin and terrified. The crowd spilled out into the dusty street. A small group was gathered around the town's communal well. A young boy, no older than 7, had been climbing on the wooden housing and had slipped, falling into the dark opening. His mother was hysterical, clawing at the stone lip of the well. The boy could be heard crying from the darkness below, his voice echoing unnervingly. He was stuck, wedged somehow in the narrow shaft partway down. The men gathered around, shouting useless advice. "Get a rope, he's too far down. Someone's got to go down there." But the opening was narrow, and no one made a move. Sheriff Pike pushed his way through, peering into the darkness. He was a man of bluster, not action, and his hesitation was plain to see. As the chaos swirled, a figure detached itself from the deep shadows of the alley between the saloon and the land office. It was Nantan Lobo. He moved with a silent, fluid grace, his eyes fixed on the well. He had been watching. He had not left her alone after all. Before anyone could fully register his presence, he was at the well's edge. He brushed past the frantic mother, placing a calming hand on her shoulder for a brief second. He spoke a single, sharp command to the gawking men. "The bucket rope, now." Someone, startled into action, untied the thick rope from its cleat. Nantan took it, testing its strength in his hands. He looked down into the darkness, his head cocked, listening to the boy's cries. Then, without a moment's hesitation, he swung his legs over the edge and began to lower himself into the well, his buckskin-clad body disappearing into the blackness. The crowd was stunned into silence. The man they had just been vowing to hang, the savage, the devil himself, was now the only person acting to save one of their own children. Maggie held her breath, her heart pounding. It was a risk of unimaginable proportions. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The only sound was the faint scraping of Nantan's boots against the stone lining and the muffled, frightened sobs of the boy. Then, a new sound. Nantan's voice, low and calm, speaking words she could not understand, but their soothing, steady tone was unmistakable. The boy's crying quieted. Finally, Nantan's head and shoulders reappeared. He was covered in grime and slime from the well, but in his arms he held the child, who was clinging to him like a burr. Nantan swung the boy out onto the solid ground and into his mother's waiting arms. For a moment, there was just the sound of the mother's relieved sobbing. The townspeople stared, their faces a mixture of awe, confusion, and dawning suspicion. The man who had just emerged from the well was not a monster. He was a rescuer. Then someone recognized him. It might have been Pike, or one of the men from the saloon. It's him, it's Nantan Lobo. The spell was broken. The brief moment of shared humanity evaporated, replaced by the old, familiar fear and hatred. The confusion on the men's faces hardened into aggression. They began to close in, forming a tight, menacing circle around the well. Around Nantan, the boy and his mother were quickly shuffled to the back of the crowd. "Don't let him get away," Pike bellowed, drawing his pistol. "He's mine." Nantan stood his ground, his eyes darting around the circle of hostile faces, assessing, calculating. He had not a single weapon, only his bare hands. He had risked everything for a child, and his reward was a mob baying for his blood. Maggie's mind raced. The law was a sham. The crowd was a beast. There was only one tool she had, one connection to the outside world, to a higher authority. She turned and ran, not away, but toward the small telegraph office at the end of the street. She fumbled with the key, her hands shaking, and let herself in. She threw herself into the operator's chair, her fingers finding the familiar brass key. She began to tap out the call signal for the Tucson station. Nothing. The line was dead. A cold, heavy certainty settled in her stomach. It was not an accident. The line out on the trail had been cut to isolate the coach. This line, the town's line, had been cut to isolate the truth. Pike, or whoever he worked for, had thought of everything. Outside, a shout went up. She looked out the window just as Nantan made his move. He feinted to the left and then burst through a gap on the right, shoving two men aside. He was impossibly fast, a blur of motion. He disappeared into the narrow, dark alleyway he had emerged from moments before. Pike fired his gun into the air, more out of frustration than aim, and the mob surged after him. A disorganized, vengeful pack. Maggie did not think. She acted. She ran from the telegraph office, her heart a wild thing in her chest. She saw the mob pour into the alley's entrance, blocking it. She knew the other end of the alley opened onto a side street. She raced around the block, her boots slipping in the deep dust. She reached the other end just as Nantan emerged from the shadows. He was breathing hard but was unhurt. He saw her and stopped, surprised. In that same instant, the sounds of the pursuing mob grew louder from the other end of the narrow passage. They were trapped. He looked at her, his dark eyes filled with 1,000 questions. In that moment, Maggie Hale, the widow, the practical telegraph runner from Ohio, made a choice that would define the rest of her life. She was no longer just an observer, a witness pushed along by events. She was a participant. She ran to him, not past him, not away from him, but to him. She reached out and her hand found his. His skin was cool and steady. She closed her fingers around his hand, her grip firm, an anchor. It was a public act, a declaration made in the flickering lantern light of Redemption Gulch. She was with him. Her lot was cast. "This way," she said, her voice steady. She pulled him toward the deeper shadows of the livery stables. Nantan looked down at their joined hands, and then back at her face. A flicker of something profound, something more than surprise, passed through his eyes. He squeezed her hand once, a firm, answering pressure, and together they ran into the night. The livery stable was a maze of shadows and the warm, dusty scent of hay and horse. Nantan moved through it with a liquid silence, leading Maggie by the hand. He retrieved his own horse and saddled another, a steady-looking mare, his movements economical and swift. Outside, the shouts of the mob echoed. A beast searching for its prey. There was no time for words. He helped her mount, and they rode out the back of the stable, keeping to the deepest pockets of night, slipping out of Redemption Gulch like two ghosts leaving a nightmare behind. They did not ride far. He led her to a small, defensible cluster of rocks a mile from the town, a place where they could see without being seen. From the darkness, two figures emerged, one small, one larger, moving with a frightened urgency. It was the woman from the well and her son. The woman's name was Rosa Martinez, and she clutched her son's hand tightly, her face pale in the starlight. "They would have hurt him," Rosa said, her voice a ragged whisper, looking back toward the town. "For being saved by you, for being a witness." She looked at Nantan, her eyes filled with a fierce, protective gratitude that transcended race and reputation. She had seen the truth, and like Maggie, she had chosen it. Nantan simply nodded, accepting her presence as an inevitable consequence of his actions. And so their small, strange fellowship was formed an Apache chief, a telegraph operator from Ohio, a Mexican midwife, and her young son, Mateo. 4 lives intertwined by a single act of violence and a single act of grace. Their path lay through Apache Pass, a rugged, unforgiving gash through the mountains. It was a place of ambush and legend, but it was also the most direct route, the path the telegraph line had taken. Nantan's plan was simple and dangerous: to follow the severed wire back to the hand that had cut it. The journey was a trial by ordeal. The sun was a relentless enemy, turning the rocks into griddles and leaching the moisture from their bodies. The nights offered little relief, plunging to a bitter cold that seeped into their bones. Water was their constant obsession, a treasure measured in sips. Nantan taught them to find it, to recognize the signs, but the land was stingy. They were always thirsty. Dust devils, like malevolent spirits of the desert, would spin up without warning, forcing them to huddle together, shielding Mateo with their bodies as the world dissolved into a blinding, stinging vortex of sand and grit. Through it all, they endured. Maggie discovered a resilience she never knew she possessed. The soft hands that knew the delicate touch of a telegraph key learned the chafe of rains, the heft of a waterskin. Rosa, with her quiet strength and knowledge of desert herbs, proved indispensable, finding remedies for sunburn and soothing Mateo's fears with soft lullabies in Spanish. Nantan was their guide and protector, his senses alive to every shift in the wind, every track in the dust. He moved through this harsh world not as a conqueror, but as a part of it, in a constant, respectful dialogue with the land. On the 4th day, as they rested in the sparse shade of a granite overhang, they saw the dust cloud. It was low and purposeful, moving too fast to be a whirlwind. Riders. Nantan had them concealed in moments, hidden among the rocks, their horses quieted with a touch and a low word. They were a hard-looking group of 5 men, riding under no official banner. Their faces were sun-scorched and bearded, their eyes narrowed against the glare. They were heavily armed and moved with the lazy confidence of predators. Nantan watched them, his body tense as a drawn bowstring. "Tijones," he murmured, the name a curse. Badgers, men who did the dirty work for hire, digging out whatever their employers wanted removed. Leading them was a man with a long, drooping mustache and a coldness in his eyes that the desert sun could not account for. Maggie felt a chill despite the heat. These men were not lawmen. They were hunters. Just as the Tijones were about to pass their position, another rider appeared, coming from the opposite direction. He was a tall, broad-shouldered black man, sitting his army horse with an erect, disciplined posture. The uniform was gone, but the bearing remained. He rode alone, and his eyes, like Nantan's, missed nothing. He reined in his horse, blocking the path. "Caleb Doolin," the lone rider said. his voice a deep, calm rumble that carried in the still air. His gaze was fixed on the man with the cold eyes. "Isaiah Reed," Doolin replied, a sneer in his voice. "I heard you gave up your blue suit, playing scout for yourself these days." "I am investigating the attack on the Butterfield stage," Isaiah said, ignoring the jibe. "The official report mentions Apache raiders, but I was at the site. I saw the tracks." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the men behind Doolin. "Tracks from Army-issue boots, like the ones your man over there is wearing." A flicker of unease went through Doolin's men. One of them instinctively looked down at his own footwear. "My men wear what they please," Doolin snarled. "We are tracking the Apache chief Nantan Lobo. There is a bounty." "Is there?" Isaiah's voice was dangerously soft. "Or are you just cleaning up a mess? I also heard a woman, a witness, disappeared from Redemption Gulch, and that the Apache chief saved a child's life right before he was run out of town by a mob. The stories are getting tangled." "Caleb." Doolin's hand drifted toward the pistol at his hip. "You should ride on. Reed, this is not your concern." "When soldiers' gear shows up at a massacre attributed to Indians, it becomes my concern," Isaiah said, his hand remaining steady on his reins. He did not reach for a weapon, but there was an iron certainty in his posture that was more threatening than any gun. "It offends my conscience, and it makes me wonder what other lies are being told." From his hiding place, Nantan watched the standoff, a new light in his eyes. This man, this former soldier, was an unknown element, an unexpected piece on the board. He was speaking a language of evidence and logic, the very things Nantan had begun to believe were useless in this land. Doolin stared at Isaiah for a long, tense moment. He had 5 men to Isaiah's 1, but Isaiah Reed was not just any man. He was a former Buffalo soldier, a decorated sergeant whose reputation for tenacity and marksmanship was known throughout the territory. An open fight would be bloody, and it would draw attention. The one thing Doolin's employers did not want. With a curse, Doolin wheeled his horse around. "We are wasting time." He spat at his men and kicked his horse into a gallop, leading his posse away. Isaiah watched them go, his face impassive. Then, he turned his head and looked directly at the rocks where Nantan's party was hidden. "You can come out now," he said. "They will not be back today." Slowly, Nantan and the others emerged from their cover. Isaiah's eyes widened slightly as he took in the unlikely group, his gaze lingering on Maggie and then on Rosa and her son. "It seems the stories are even more tangled than I thought," he said. Dismounting, he looked at Nantan, not with the hatred or fear Maggie was used to seeing, but with a straight, appraising respect. "I am not your enemy. I am looking for the truth of what happened to that stagecoach. It seems you are as well." An alliance was forged in the heat and dust of Apache Pass, a bond of shared purpose between 4 different cultures, 4 people pushed together by a common enemy. With Isaiah's help, their journey became easier. He knew the patrol routes and the hidden waterholes. Together, they followed the severed telegraph wire. It led them, as Nantan had suspected, away from any known Apache encampment. It led them into the foothills that bordered the vast holdings of the Baines Mining Company. The wire did not end at a burned-out station, but at a large, windowless supply warehouse that stood a few miles from the main mining camp. A silent, anonymous building in the middle of nowhere. Under the cover of darkness, Nantan and Isaiah forced a rear door. Inside, the air was stale, smelling of machine oil, burlap, and sawdust. Crates were stacked to the ceiling, most of them unmarked. But in a corner, partially covered by a canvas tarp, was a large crate with the Baines Mining Company seal stenciled on its side. Isaiah pried it open with a crowbar. Inside, nestled in a bed of straw, was a brand new spool of copper telegraph wire. It was enough wire to restring the line from Redemption Gulch to Tucson. It was undeniable proof of a planned, deliberate sabotage. But there was something else in the warehouse. On a rough wooden desk in a small office space, an accounting ledger lay open, as if left in a hurry. Maggie, drawn by a lifetime of literacy and order, picked it up. The entries were cryptic, columns of figures under headings like security, transport, and contingency. Her eyes scanned the page. Then she saw a line item under a subheading labeled clearing operations. It was a large payment made out to J. Pike. Another was made to C. Doolin. It was the proof they needed, a direct link between the sheriff, the bounty hunter, and some secret fund. But as Maggie stared at the page, a cold dread, heavier and more profound than any she had yet felt, began to creep over her. It was not the names that held her transfixed. It was the handwriting. It was a neat, precise, slightly slanted script. The letters were formed with a draftsman's care, the numbers meticulously aligned. It was a hand she had seen 1,000 times, on geological notes, on household lists, on the loving letters he had written her during their courtship. Her breath caught in her throat. Her vision narrowed until the ledger was the only thing in the world. She reached out a trembling finger and traced the capital W in the word wages. It was his unmistakable. This was William's handwriting, her husband's handwriting. The man she had mourned, the man she believed had been the victim of a tragic accident, had been keeping a secret ledger of payments to corrupt lawmen and hired thugs. The world tilted on its axis, the simple story of her life, of a good man lost too soon, fractured and fell apart, revealing an abyss beneath it. The mind collapse a year ago was no longer a random act of fate. It was a loose thread, and she had just found the end of it. The truth she had been searching for was not just about Nantan or a stolen piece of land. It was about her own past, about the man she had loved, and she realized with a terrible, soul-crushing certainty that William's death had not been an accident at all. The ledger felt impossibly heavy in Maggie's hands, its weight not from paper and ink, but from the crushing reality it contained. The neat, familiar script of her dead husband was a ghost that had risen from the dust of the warehouse, rewriting her entire past. William had not been a victim. He had been a cog in a murderous machine. And then, the machine had consumed him. The grief that had been her constant companion for a year did not vanish. It transmuted into something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous rage. In the pre-dawn chill of the foothills, the four of them held a council of war. The partial ledger was damning, but it was incomplete. It was a single page from a larger book, a book that almost certainly resided in the heart of the beast itself, the main office of the Baines Mining Company. Going to the law was not an option. The law in this part of the territory, in the form of Sheriff Pike, was on the payroll. They will have a complete record, Isaiah said, his voice a low rumble. Men like Baines. They are arrogant. They believe their power makes them invisible. They write everything down. Then we must get that book, Maggie stated. It was not a question. Her voice was flat, devoid of the tremor they might have expected. The woman who had been a frightened survivor at a ruined stagecoach was gone. In her place was a woman with a purpose as clear and sharp as a shard of glass. The plan they devised was audacious, born of desperation and a shared desire for justice. They would not attack the mining camp. They would become a part of it, hiding in plain sight. The Baines mining camp was a town unto itself, a sprawling, ugly collection of unpainted buildings clinging to the side of a mountain that was being systematically disemboweled. Smoke from the smelter stained the sky a perpetual, greasy gray, and the rhythmic, percussive clang of the stamp mill was a constant, metallic heartbeat. It was a place built on labor and greed, where men disappeared into the earth each morning and emerged each evening, their faces coated in the same gray dust that covered everything. Maggie went in first. She had washed her face, braided her hair neatly, and adopted an air of weary but respectable widowhood. She presented herself at the office of the mine superintendent, a man named Henderson. He was a harried-looking man with a perpetually furrowed brow, more interested in production quotas than in the people who met them. Maggie, using her experience as a tutor, offered her services for his young daughter, Emily, with the nearest proper school a 2-day ride away. Henderson, eager to keep his wife from complaining about the child's lack of refinement, hired her on the spot. She was given a small room in their modest house, a room with a clear view of the main office building across the dusty yard. Isaiah Reed, a strong back in search of a day's wage, was a common sight in any western town. He was hired with barely a question, assigned to a crew hauling timber for the shoring of new tunnels. The work was brutal, backbreaking, but it gave him access to the camp's layout, the shift changes, the patterns of the guards. Rosa Martinez, with young Mateo in tow, found her way to the cookhouse. A place like this was always in need of an extra pair of hands to peel potatoes, scrub pots, and mend clothing for the miners. She and Mateo were given a small corner in a storage room, and her quiet, unassuming presence made her effectively invisible. She could listen to the gossip of the teamsters and the kitchen staff, gathering the small, everyday details that could prove useful. Nantan was the greatest risk. He could not simply walk into the camp. He arrived as a trader, a man with a string of sturdy ponies to sell, a common enough sight. He set up a temporary camp on the periphery, near the corrals, a position that allowed him to observe the comings and goings without drawing undue attention. He bargained with the hostlers, his quiet, reserved demeanor mistaken for simple stoicism. Days turned into a week. Maggie began her lessons with Emily Henderson, a lonely, quiet child. She discovered the superintendent was a man ruled by routine. He left his office for precisely 1 hour at midday and every evening at 6. He locked the main ledger in the heavy iron safe behind his desk. Getting the book would not be easy. Maggie's internal world had become a quiet, frozen place. The sharp pain of William's loss had been replaced by a slow, burning anger and a profound sense of guilt. How could she have been so blind? Had she ever truly known the man she married? She went through the motions of her days, teaching Emily her letters, speaking politely to Mrs. Henderson. But inside, she was a hunter, watching, waiting, her senses honed for any opportunity. The first tangible piece of the puzzle came from Rosa, in the back of a large pantry. Behind sacks of flour and beans, she found several small, heavy barrels. They were unmarked, but one had a broken lid. Inside was a fine, reddish-brown powder. It was ochre, the same pigment used by countless tribes for ceremony and war paint. But this was not sacred earth. This was a bulk supply, coarse and commercial. It was the color of the fake blood and paint the raiders had used. It was the color of a lie, stored next to the kitchen salt and sugar, a mundane ingredient for a recipe of manufactured hate. The next piece came from Nantan, as he haggled over the price of a mule with one of the teamsters. Caleb Doolin and 2 of his Tajones rode into camp. They moved with the proprietary air of men who were above the rules. Doolin stopped near Nantan, his cold eyes sweeping over the Apache's string of horses. Nantan kept his head lowered, his wide-brimmed hat casting his face in shadow. He grunted non-committal replies to the teamster, his body language that of a simple, weary horse trader. Doolin, however, paused. He stared at Nantan for a long, uncomfortable moment. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, a vague, nagging familiarity he could not quite place. He saw a tall Apache, a powerful build, but the face was obscured, the posture deliberately non-threatening. Nantan could feel the man's gaze on him, a physical pressure. He did not move, did not react, his heart a steady, slow drum. Finally, Doolin snorted, dismissing the flicker of intuition, and rode on toward the superintendent's office. The danger had passed, but it was a chilling reminder of how thin their disguises were. The opportunity finally came on a sweltering afternoon. A support timber had cracked in one of the lower tunnels, and Henderson was called away in a panic, leaving the office in a rush. He had forgotten to lock the safe. Maggie saw it from her window. She made a quick excuse to his wife, sending Emily to her room for a nap, and slipped out of the house, Her heart hammered against her ribs as she crossed the yard. The office was empty, smelling of stale cigar smoke and paperwork. The safe door was slightly ajar. She pulled it open. Inside were stacks of currency, survey maps, and a single, thick, leather-bound volume, Ledger Number 2. She took it to the desk, her hands shaking so badly she could barely turn the pages. The handwriting was the same. Williams, but this book was far more detailed. She found the section for security. There were the payments to Pike and Doolin, listed by date. And then she saw it, a line item, dated 3 weeks before the stagecoach attack, for the purchase of costumes, 30 sets, and another for red paint, 5 barrels. A wave of nausea washed over her. It was all here, in black and white, the cold, methodical planning of a massacre. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the columns. She had to find William's name. She found it in a section at the back, under a list of salaried employees. William Hale. Accounting. A series of monthly payments were noted next to his name. And then the final entry. It was dated the day he died. It was not a payment. It was a single word, written in Henderson's spiky, impatient script, next to the date. Terminated. The word was a gunshot in the silent room. Not deceased, not killed in accident, terminated, like a contract, like a loose end. He had known too much, kept the wrong secrets, and so they had eliminated him. They had buried him under tons of rock in a mountain of lies. Maggie closed the book. The shaking in her hands had stopped. The rage inside her had burned away the nausea, the fear, the guilt, leaving behind a core of pure, unadulterated resolve. She was no longer just a truth seeker. She was an avenger. She would not just expose these men, she would see them destroyed. She was so focused on the ledger that she did not hear the footsteps outside the door. It was Caleb Doolin, returning from his meeting. He pushed the door open, then stopped cold. Seeing her there, the open safe, the ledger in her hands. His eyes, which had held only vague suspicion when he'd seen Nantan, now widened in shocked recognition. "You," he breathed. "The woman from the stagecoach." His hand dropped to his gun. Maggie did not scream. She reacted. She threw the heavy ledger with all her might. It caught him square in the chest, knocking him off balance with a grunt of pain. It was the only head start she would get. She bolted out the back door of the office just as he fired. The shot splintered the door frame next to her head. An alarm bell began to clang somewhere in the camp. Shouts erupted. Their cover was blown. Isaiah, hearing the shot from the timber yard, dropped his load and began running, not away, but toward the chaos. Toward her. Rosa grabbed Mateo, her eyes wide with terror, and melted into the shadows behind the cookhouse. Nantan, already moving at the first sound of the bell, vaulted onto the bare back of his fastest pony. Maggie ran, her lungs burning, the sounds of pursuit close behind. She saw Isaiah waving, gesturing toward a dark opening at the base of the slag heap behind the smelter. "The ventilation shaft," he yelled. She scrambled toward it, Doolin's second shot kicking up dust at her heels. Isaiah reached her, grabbing her arm and half throwing her toward the opening. Nantan galloped past, not stopping, but leaning down to slap the rumps of the mules in Doolin's path, sending them scattering and creating a momentary diversion. Isaiah shoved Maggie into the dark, narrow tunnel, then scrambled in after her. It was pitch black and smelled of damp earth and stale air. They could hear Doolin and his men shouting at the entrance. A gunshot echoed in the confined space, the bullet ricocheting with a high, terrifying whine. They crawled deeper into the darkness, into the guts of the mountain. The ledger clutched tightly in Maggie's hands like a sacred text, their only shield and their only sword. The ventilation shaft was a throat of cold, black earth. Maggie and Isaiah crawled on hands and knees, the air thick with the metallic tang of unmined ore and the damp chill of the deep. The heavy ledger, which Maggie refused to let go, bumped and scraped against the rock, its corners digging into her ribs. Behind them, the shouts and echoes of Doolin's men faded. replaced by the sound of their own ragged breathing and the frantic beating of their hearts. They emerged, gasping, into the bruised light of dusk, exiting through a grate on a deserted slope far above the main camp. Below them, the Baines mining operation was a swarm of angry, torchlit activity. They were hunted. There was no going back. They found Rosa and Mateo huddled in a dry wash, their faces pale with fear. A short time later, Nantan joined them, appearing out of the twilight as silently as an owl. His face was a grim, unreadable mask, but his eyes, when they met Maggie's, held a deep and burning concern. He saw the ledger clutched in her arms and understood. The game had changed. They traveled through the night, pushing themselves and their horses to the limits of their endurance. They were no longer following a trail. They were fleeing, erasing their own tracks as they went. Their destination was a temporary camp Nantan knew of, a place where a few of his distant kin sometimes wintered, nestled in a box canyon miles from any established routes. It was their only hope for a safe harbor. As the sun rose on the second day, a thin, dark finger of smoke appeared on the northern horizon. It was in the direction of the canyon. Nantan saw it first. He reined in his horse so sharply it reared, its whinny a sharp cry in the morning stillness. A dreadful silence fell over their small group. Smoke in the desert rarely meant anything good. It was a signal of disaster. Nantan said nothing. He did not need to. He kicked his horse into a desperate, punishing gallop, his body low over the animal's neck. Isaiah, Maggie, and Rosa followed, their hearts sinking with every hoofbeat that brought them closer to that ominous pillar of black. The smell reached them first, the sickeningly sweet and acrid stench of burned pine, burned canvas, and something else, something horrifyingly final. When they reached the mouth of the canyon, they saw what was left. It had been a small, peaceful encampment. Now it was a smoldering ruin. The wickiups were blackened skeletons, their brush and hide coverings consumed by a furious, deliberate fire. Possessions lay scattered and broken, pottery smashed, blankets torn and scorched. The spring that had given the canyon its life now flowed through a bed of black sludge and gray ash. It was not a battle. It was a massacre of a home. Nantan dismounted, his movements stiff, as if his limbs had turned to stone. He walked through the devastation, his eyes taking in every detail. This was not a random act of cruelty. It was a message, sent by Silas Baines, delivered by men like Doolin. A message written in fire and ash, meant for him. They found the survivors huddled in a cave behind the spring, their faces blank with shock. An old woman began to keen, a low, mournful sound that was the only voice in the desolate canyon. She told them what happened. Riders had come near dawn. Without warning, they had not come to fight. They had come to burn. They had ridden through the small camp, torches in hand, setting fire to everything, laughing as they did. And then Maggie saw him. Nantan was kneeling on the ground near the blackened remains of the largest wickiup. He was not moving. Isaiah walked over to him, then stopped, his hand going to his mouth. Maggie felt a cold dread snake around her heart. She walked forward, her feet unsteady on the ash-covered ground, and looked down. It was Nali Awen. She lay on a scorched blanket, a small child of about 4 years old asleep, or unconscious. In the circle of her arms, Nali's face was peaceful, untouched by the flames, but a dark stain on the ground beneath her told the story of her end. The old woman explained, her voice choked with tears. When the fire had engulfed her home, Nali had run back inside, not for a possession, but for the child, who had been trapped in his sleeping furs. She had found him, shielded him with her own body, and passed him out a tier in the burning hide wall to safety. But as she tried to follow, a falling, burning timber had struck her from behind. She had saved the child, but she had not been able to save herself. Nantan reached out a trembling hand and gently touched his sister's cheek. He stayed like that for a long time, a silent, unmoving statue of grief, the leader who had faced down a mob. The warrior who moved with such power and grace was now just a man kneeling in the ashes of his world, mourning his sister. Maggie's own anger, her own quest for vengeance for William, seemed small and selfish in the face of this profound, senseless loss. William had, in his own way, been part of the machine that had ultimately led to this. The ledger in her saddlebag felt like it was burning a hole through the leather. It was not just a book of numbers. It was a testament to an evil that spread like a fire, consuming everything good and decent in its path. They held the funeral that evening. As the sun set and painted the smoke-stained sky in hues of impossible beauty, it was a simple, solemn affair. Nali's body was wrapped in clean blankets and placed on a scaffold on a high ledge, open to the sky she had known so well. Her people sang, their voices rising and falling in a song of sorrow and remembrance that seemed to be pulled from the very stones of the canyon. Maggie stood beside Nantan throughout the ceremony. She did not understand the words, but she understood the language of loss. She saw the tears tracking through the grime on the faces of the survivors, and she felt their grief as if it were her own. When the singing was done, the old woman, Nali's aunt, came to Nantan. She spoke to him in their tongue, her voice soft. Then she turned to Maggie. She held out her hand, and in her palm was a simple, beautiful thing, a small loop of braided black horsehair, intricately woven with a single blue bead. It was the tie Nali had used for her hair. The old woman took Maggie's hand and gently pressed the hair tie into her palm, closing Maggie's fingers around it. She looked deep into Maggie's eyes, and in that look, there was a profound transfer of trust, of responsibility. Maggie was no longer an outsider. She was a sharer of their sorrow, a keeper of a memory. She had been given a piece of Nali's spirit to carry. Later that night, when the camp was quiet and the survivors were finally asleep, Maggie could not rest. She walked away from the dying embers of the communal fire, past the silent, grieving figure of Nantan, and down to the small stream that flowed from the spring. The water, at least, was running clear again, washing the ash away. The moon was a silver sliver in the sliver of sky above the canyon, and the air was cool and clean. She knelt by the water's edge, clutching the ledger in one hand and Nali's hair tie in the other. Fire and water, destruction and healing. Everything felt overwhelming, impossibly vast and complicated. The weight of the lives lost, the lives they still had to protect, the damning evidence in the book, the long and dangerous road ahead. It was too much. She heard a footstep on the rocks behind her and knew, without turning, that it was Nantan. He came and stood beside her, a tall, dark shape against the stars. For a long time, neither of them spoke. There were no words that could fill the space hollowed out by their shared grief. Finally, her voice a raw, trembling whisper in the stillness. Maggie looked from the ledger to his face. She felt the tears she had been holding back begin to fall, hot against her cold skin. The whole broken, terrible world was in her hands, and she did not know which piece to pick up first. "Where should I begin?" she asked. The Apache chief knelt beside her. He did not answer her question with a plan or a strategy. He answered it by reaching out and taking her hand, the one that was not holding the ledger, his fingers wrapped around hers, his touch gentle but firm, a lifeline in the darkness. He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw not the warrior's fire, but a deep, quiet promise, a commitment that went beyond words, anywhere close to forever. The words were a quiet vow in the vast silence of the desert night. It was not an answer for the battle ahead, but for the life they would live. It was a promise that this moment was not an end, but a beginning. He pulled her gently toward him, and she went, burying her face in the rough buckskin of his shoulder. He held her, his arms a circle of strength and solace, and they clung to each other. Two lonely souls who had found their anchor in the heart of a storm. They were not a chief and an outsider. They were simply a man and a woman, bound together by tragedy, by a shared enemy, and by the quiet, unshakable truth that their forever had already begun. They stayed like that for a long time, the sound of the stream a quiet song of healing around them. When she finally drew back, the tears were gone, and the despair in her heart had been replaced by the steady, burning ember of resolve. She looked at the ledger, then back at him. "Tucson," she said, her voice clear. "There is a newspaper man there. Amos Finch. He is an honest man. He will print the truth." Nantan looked at the book, the source of so much pain, but also their only weapon. The path of evidence, the path of the white man's law, was a trail he had never trusted. But he trusted the woman who now stood beside him. Her courage, her fire, had shown him that there was more than one way to fight. To avenge Nali, to save his people, he could not just be a warrior. He had to be more. He nodded, his decision made, to ride into the heart of the enemy's world, to wager their lives on a piece of paper and the conscience of a stranger, was the greatest risk of all. But looking at Maggie, her face illuminated by the faint moonlight, her hand still in his, he knew it was a risk they had to take together. The journey away from the Canyon of Ashes was a grim, silent affair. Their small band, now numbering 6 with the addition of the survivors they could safely escort, was no longer just a group of fugitives. They were couriers, carrying a truth so explosive it had already cost lives. The leather-bound ledger, wrapped carefully in oilcloth and tucked deep within Maggie's saddlebags, was the focus of their existence. They traveled for 2 days, moving through the harsh, forgotten corners of the territory. Isaiah Reed's military experience was invaluable. He navigated by the stars, found watering holes the maps ignored, and set a pace that was grueling but sustainable. He and Nantan moved in a seamless, unspoken partnership, one covering their tracks while the other scouted ahead. They were 2 men from worlds meant to be at war, now united by a code of honor that transcended uniforms and skin color. Their destination was a desolate stretch of the Southern Pacific Railroad line, miles from any station. According to Isaiah, the weekly silver train, a special high-priority transport from the Baines smelter to the banks in Tucson, was forced to slow at a steep grade to take on water from a trackside tank. It was their only chance. They arrived under the cloak of a moonless night, the twin steel rails gleaming faintly in the starlight. The silence was profound, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the low whisper of the wind. They hid themselves and their horses in a deep arroyo 100 yards from the tracks. Rosa huddled with Mateo, wrapping him in a blanket, murmuring stories to keep him quiet and calm. The survivors from the canyon, an elderly man and his granddaughter, watched with wide, fearful eyes. "The train will be here within the hour," Isaiah said, checking the cheap pocket watch he kept. "It is heavily guarded, but they will be focused on the silver car. Up front, our best chance is the rear baggage and mail car. They keep one guard there." The plan was desperate. Nantan and Isaiah would handle the guard. Maggie, Rosa, and the others would have to climb aboard in the few moments of confusion. The wait was agonizing. Every rustle of a bush, every cry of a distant coyote, set Maggie's nerves on edge. She clutched the ledger to her chest, its hard corners a tangible reminder of the stakes. Nantan sat motionless nearby, a figure carved from the night. He was not looking at the tracks, but at her. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the fear she was trying so hard to master. He reached over, not touching her, but letting his presence be a steadying force in the darkness. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He offered the simple, profound reassurance of his quiet solidarity. Then they heard it, a low, rhythmic rumble that grew steadily, vibrating up from the ground, through the soles of their boots, and into their bones. A single, bright light cut through the blackness, and the ground began to shake as the iron behemoth approached, hissing steam and breathing smoke. The train slowed with a great groaning and screeching of brakes, just as Isaiah had predicted. In the hiss of escaping steam, Nantan and Isaiah moved. They were shadows detaching from shadows, flowing over the ground with a speed and silence that was breathtaking. They reached the rear car just as a bored-looking guard stepped out onto the platform for a breath of air. It was over before the man could make a sound. Isaiah caught him as he fell, unconscious, and they dragged him out of sight. Now Isaiah hissed. Maggie ran, pulling Rosa and Mateo with her. The old man and his granddaughter followed, their movements clumsy with fear. Climbing onto the high platform of the moving train was a terrifying scramble of grabbing hands and straining muscles. But they made it, tumbling into the dark. Cramped interior of the baggage car just as it began to pick up speed again. The car was a chaotic space, filled with crates, mail bags, and the smell of canvas and axle grease. They huddled together in the rocking darkness, the clatter of the wheels a deafening, constant roar. They were on their way to Tucson. They were trapped in a steel box, hurtling toward a confrontation they could only guess at. As dawn broke, casting long, dusty shafts of light through the grimy slats of the car, Maggie knew they could not simply wait. Baines would know they had the ledger. He would not allow the train to reach Tucson unchallenged. "The telegraph," she said, her voice loud over the noise of the train. "The lines run right alongside the tracks. If I can tap into them, I can send a message to Amos Finch. I can send him the ledger." Isaiah looked at her, his brow furrowed. "Send the ledger how?" "In code," she said, her mind already working, seeing the patterns of dots and dashes. "I can summarize the key entries, the payments to Pike and Doolin, the purchase orders for the paint and costumes, the date of my husband's termination. It will be enough. Enough to get the story printed, to alert the territorial marshal before Baines can bury it." It was a brilliant, insane plan, but it was their only chance to get ahead of their enemy. While Nantan stood guard at the door, Isaiah and Maggie searched the car. They found a small emergency kit containing a portable telegraph key and a small battery, but it was meant for use at a station, not on a moving train. They also found a spool of thin copper wire. "We need to get this wire to the main line," Maggie said, holding up the spool. Nantan looked out the slatted door at the telegraph poles flashing past, the wires a continuous, hypnotic line against the sky. The train was swaying, moving at nearly 40 miles an hour. To connect a thin wire to that line would be nearly impossible. "I will do it," he said simply. He took the wire from her, along with a heavy iron grappling hook they had found in a crate of railroad tools. He tied the wire securely to the hook, then made his way to the rear platform of the car. The wind tore at him, whipping his hair and clothes. The ground was a dizzying blur below. Maggie and Isaiah watched, their hearts in their throats, as Nantan began to climb the iron ladder to the roof. He moved with the uncanny balance of a man born to high, dangerous places. The roof was a narrow, swaying perch, covered in soot and cinders. He braced himself against the wind, the grappling hook and its trailing wire in his hand. He began to swing it, a slow, rhythmic circle, building momentum. He was waiting for the perfect moment, the perfect confluence of the train's sway and the dip of the wire between poles. He swung and let it fly. The hook sailed through the air, a metal bird against the morning sky, and with a shower of sparks, caught the telegraph line. Maggie did not wait to see if it held. She was already at her makeshift station, the key wired to the battery and the new live connection. She placed her fingers on the cool brass and began to send, her whole world narrowing to the rhythmic click and clack of the key. Dot, dot, dash, dot, dash, dot. She sent the call signal for the Tucson Chronicle, over and over, praying Amos Finch, or any competent operator, was there to hear. Then she began to transmit the contents of the ledger, her mind a flurry of translation. turning names and numbers and damning phrases into the universal language of the telegraph. Baines, Pike, Doolin, red paint, costumes, William Hale, terminated. A story of greed and murder, sent out into the world on a stolen current of electricity. She was so absorbed she did not notice the change in the train's rhythm, the subtle slowing as it approached a small, unscheduled stop in the middle of nowhere. A group of men were waiting by the tracks. Some were familiar. Hard-faced to Jones. Leading them was Sheriff Josiah Pike, and with him, a half-dozen men in the clean, crisp blue uniforms of United States federal soldiers. The train hissed to a stop. Pike and the soldiers boarded, moving with a grim purpose through the passenger cars. Nantan, still on the roof, saw them coming and scrambled back down, his face a mask of cold fury. Their trap was closing. The door to the baggage car was thrown open. Pike stood there, a triumphant sneer on his face. Behind him stood a man with a sergeant's stripes on his sleeve. "Margaret Hale," Pike boomed. "You are under arrest for theft and consorting with a known fugitive. These federal officers are here to confiscate that stolen property." He pointed at the ledger, which lay open beside Maggie. The sergeant stepped forward, his hand out. "We will take that, ma'am. Official business." Maggie looked to Isaiah. Something was wrong. The soldiers' uniforms were too clean, their rifles a model that had been recently decommissioned. Isaiah Reed stepped forward, placing himself between Maggie and the soldiers. He looked the sergeant up and down, a professional assessing an amateur. "Which regiment?" Isaiah asked, his voice calm. "Ninth Cavalry, out of Fort Grant," the sergeant said smoothly. It was a plausible lie. Isaiah nodded slowly. "I served with the Ninth for a time. Under Colonel Hatch." He paused. "Strange thing about the Ninth. We had a saying we used for the daily password change. A call and response. You must remember it." The sergeant's eyes flickered with uncertainty. "We have our orders." "The call was the Colonel's coffee," Isaiah said, his voice hard as iron now. "What, Sergeant?" was the response. The man stared. His bluff called. He had no answer. The silence stretched. Pike's face began to purple with rage. Isaiah smiled, but it was a terrifying thing to see. The response, "You flat-footed fake," was as colder than his heart. "You are no soldiers." In that instant, chaos erupted. The fake soldiers raised their rifles. But Isaiah and Nantan were already moving. Nantan threw a heavy mailbag, knocking two of the men off balance. Isaiah disarmed the sergeant with a swift, brutal efficiency. The fight spilled out of the baggage car and into the passenger car behind it, a whirlwind of fists and grunts and the sharp crack of a pistol. It was Pike who fired. His shot went wild, missing Isaiah and instead shattering a large kerosene lantern hanging from the ceiling of the next car back, the mail car. In a heartbeat, the oil ignited. Flames roared to life, feeding on the dry wooden walls and the thousands of letters and packages inside. "Fire!" a passenger screamed. Panic exploded. People scrambled away from the growing heat and smoke. The fire spread with terrifying speed, threatening to consume the entire train. Through the smoke and confusion, Nantan's voice cut through the noise, a command that demanded obedience. "Uncouple the car now." He fought his way through the terrified passengers, Isaiah right behind him. They reached the platform between the burning mail car and the passenger car. The heat was a physical blow, scorching their skin and searing their lungs. The iron coupling pin glowed a dull red, while Isaiah used his body to hold back the press of panicked people. Nantan and a brave engineer who had run back from the engine worked on the coupling. They threw their shoulders against the release lever, but it was jammed. The fire roared. The whole car now a furnace on wheels. With a great cry of effort, Nantan grabbed a heavy wrench from the engineer's hands and began to batter at the pin, his muscles straining with every blow. Maggie, Rosa, and the old man worked to calm the passengers, moving them forward, away from the flames. Rosa shielded Mateo, her body a small but fierce barrier against the chaos. In that moment of shared peril, they were no longer a collection of disparate people. They were a family, bound by fire and a common will to survive. With a final, desperate blow, Nantan shattered the pin. The coupling groaned, screeched, and broke free. The burning car, no longer attached, immediately began to lose speed, falling away from them. For a moment, it was a chariot of fire, rolling behind them, before it careened off the tracks and tumbled into a deep ravine, a blazing meteor disappearing into the wilderness. The rest of the train, now free, surged forward. They were alive, battered, bruised, and covered in soot, but alive. Maggie looked down at her telegraph key, the wire now severed. She did not know if the message had been received, but she had sent it. The truth was out there, traveling on a wire through the desert. She looked at Nantan, at Isaiah, at Rosa holding Mateo, and she knew that whatever awaited them in Tucson, they would face it together. The train limped into Tucson as the sky was turning from the deep bruised purple of night to the pale gray of dawn. The journey's end did not bring relief, only a different kind of tension. They were soot-stained, bone-weary, and walking into the heart of the enemy's territory, as Maggie, Nantan, and their small band of survivors stepped onto the platform. They were not met with silence. A crowd was already there. They were a strange sight, this patchwork family of Apache, Anglo, Black, and Mexican, and the townspeople stared, their faces a mixture of raw curiosity, suspicion, and open hostility. But something was different. Many of them were holding freshly printed copies of the Tucson Chronicle. A bold, stark headline was visible even from a distant stagecoach raid. A hoax telegraph operator accuses Baines Mining of conspiracy. Maggie's message had arrived. The truth was no longer a secret whispered in the dark. It was a public question, printed in black ink for all to see. The crowd was a restless sea, its currents pulling in two directions at once. From one side came the familiar, ugly shouts. There he is, the butcher Lobo. Hang him. But from another side, a new sound was rising, a murmur of doubt, of questions directed not at Nantan, but at the idea of Silas Baines. A man pushed his way through the crowd, his face a beacon of weary integrity. He was older, with ink stains on his fingers and the fiery eyes of a man who believed in the power of the printed word. Amos Finch, he said, extending a hand to Maggie. Your message came through in pieces, but I got enough. I printed what I had. Beside him stood two other men. One was a small, meticulously dressed man carrying a leather satchel, a notary public by his precise demeanor. The other was tall and broad, with a calm, authoritative presence and a silver star pinned to his vest that was no cheap tin. This was a United States Marshal, drawn from his office by a telegraph message that spoke of murder and federal mail tampering. Just as this fragile alliance was being formed on the platform, another group arrived, pushing through the crowd with an arrogance born of impunity. Silas Baines himself led the way, his face a thundercloud of controlled rage. At his side were Sheriff Josiah Pike, looking flustered and out of his depth, and the cold-eyed Caleb Doolin, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. Marshal Thompson, Baines said, his voice a smooth baritone that barely concealed its steel. There has been a grave misunderstanding. This woman is a hysterical runaway, and she is in the company of a known murderer. I am here to assist you in taking them into custody. Marshal Thompson did not look at Baines. His gaze was on Maggie, on the exhaustion and fierce resolve in her eyes. I will be the judge of what has been misunderstood. Mr. Baines, for now, we will discuss this on the steps of the courthouse, where all of Tucson can bear witness to the truth. The procession to the courthouse was a tense, slow march, the crowd swelling around them, a volatile mix of prejudice and dawning outrage. They stopped on the wide stone porch, the rising sun casting long shadows across the square. This is a circus, Baines declared, his voice ringing out. "This woman's accusations are baseless. She has no proof." "Oh, but I do," Maggie said, her voice clear and strong. She stepped forward and opened her satchel, producing the heavy, leather-bound ledger. She held it up for all to see. "This is your company's book of accounts. Mr. Baines, it details every payment made to Sheriff Pike and Caleb Doolin. It lists the purchase of costumes and red paint, used to stage the attack on the stagecoach." A gasp went through the crowd. Baines laughed. A sharp, dismissive sound. "A forged document, stolen by a common thief. It proves nothing." "The handwriting will prove it," Maggie countered, her heart pounding. "The entries are in the hand of my late husband, William Hale. I believe you knew him." She produced a folded, worn letter from her pocket. "This is a letter he wrote to me a month before he died. I ask that they be compared." This was Amos Finch's moment. "At my request, Mr. Alden, a certified notary public, has agreed to examine the documents," he announced. The small, precise man stepped forward. He took the letter and the ledger, laying them on the porch railing. He produced a magnifying glass from his satchel and began his examination, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The entire square held its breath. Baines's composure finally cracked. This was a development he had not anticipated. The notary, a man whose professional integrity was beyond reproach, was a threat he could not dismiss with bluster. After a long, silent minute, the notary looked up. He turned not to the marshal, but to the crowd. "The penmanship is identical," he declared, his voice crisp and certain. "The formation of the letters, the pressure of the strokes, the slant of the script, there is no question. Both documents were written by the same hand." The crowd erupted. The wall of belief that had protected Baines began to crumble. Caleb Doolin, a man who solved problems with violence, not legal maneuvering, decided he had seen enough. He drew his pistol and lunged for Nantan. "No Apache is taking me down," he snarled. Nantan moved, not away, but toward him, shoving Maggie behind him. The crowd scattered as Doolin fired, the shot going wide and splintering the courthouse door. The two men, predator and prey, disappeared into the adjacent postal warehouse, the sounds of a desperate gunfight echoing from within. While the marshal and his deputy tried to restore order, Pike saw his own opportunity for escape slipping away. His eyes, wild with panic, landed on a young woman standing at the edge of the porch, frozen in fear. He grabbed her, pulling her in front of him as a shield, and pressed the barrel of his pistol to her temple. "Everybody stay back," he screamed, his voice cracking. "I will shoot. I will." The crowd recoiled in horror. Baines watched, his face a mask of disgust at his subordinate's pathetic desperation. Nantan emerged from the warehouse, breathing hard, his knuckles bruised and bloody, but victorious. He saw Pike and the hostage, and he froze. Maggie's mind raced. Pike was a cornered rat, his actions driven by pure terror. A direct assault was too risky. She needed to break his focus. She stepped forward, her voice laced with a cold, cutting sarcasm. "Having trouble, Sheriff," she called out, her voice drawing every eye, including Pike's. "It must be difficult when the only thing you have to hang is your own argument." The taunt hit its mark. Pike's head whipped toward her, his face contorting in a snarl of pure hatred. "You!" he began. It was the only opening Nantan needed. He moved in a silent, deadly blur, covering the 10 feet between them in 2 long strides. He did not attack Pike. He struck the gun, his hand a blur of motion, knocking the weapon from Pike's grasp. It clattered harmlessly on the stone steps. In the same fluid movement, he spun the terrified woman away, pushing her back into the safety of the crowd, and slammed Pike against the courthouse wall. The sheriff, stripped of his weapon and his hostage, collapsed into a whimpering heap. All the henchmen were now neutralized. Only Silas Baines remained. He stood alone, his empire of lies and blood collapsing around him. The crowd, its allegiance now fully shifted, began to chant. Trial for Baines. Baines looked at the faces turned against him, at the marshal stepping forward to arrest him, at Nantan and Maggie standing together, symbols of his utter defeat. His smooth facade finally shattered, revealing the feral beast beneath. With a roar of fury, he pulled a small, silver derringer from his coat pocket. He did not aim at Nantan. He aimed at the law itself, at the man who represented the system that was about to crush him. He fired. Marshal Thompson cried out and staggered back, clutching his shoulder, a dark stain spreading across his blue coat. Before Baines could fire again, another shot rang out, this one from the edge of the crowd. It was Isaiah Reed. He stood with his army pistol held in a steady, two-handed grip. He had not aimed for Baines's heart, he had aimed for his hand. The derringer flew from Baines's grasp, skittering across the porch. Baines was disarmed, defeated, and utterly alone. Nantan was on him in a heartbeat. The crowd roared, a primal sound, screaming for the vengeance they now felt was justified. "Kill him, an eye for an eye," they shouted. Here was the moment. The man who had ordered the murder of Nali, the destruction of his people's homes, was helpless at his feet. Revenge was his for the taking. But Nantan looked past Baines, his gaze meeting Maggie's across the porch. He saw the trust in her eyes. He felt the memory of their promise by the stream, of a life built on something more than bloodshed. He thought of his sister, and knew she would not have wanted her memory honored with another killing. Restraint was its own kind of power. He did not draw his knife. He drew a coil of rope from Pike's belt. With swift, efficient motions, he bound Silas Baines's hands behind his back, pulling the knot brutally tight. He hauled the sputtering, cursing man to his feet and shoved him toward the wounded marshal's deputy. "Justice," Nantan said, his voice quiet but resonant, carrying over the now silent square. Through the court, not the gun. As he spoke, the sun finally crested the rooftops of Tucson, flooding the courthouse square with the clean, brilliant light of a new day. A single, golden ray fell directly upon the porch railing, illuminating the open pages of the ledger, the column of names, the catalog of crimes. The truth that had been hidden in darkness was now, finally, brought into the light for all to see. The aftermath of the dawn trial was not a celebration, but a collective, weary exhalation. The raw, violent energy that had crackled in the square dissipated, leaving behind the mundane but necessary work of putting a broken world back together. Silas Baines, his face a mask of disbelief, was led away in irons, his threats and curses ignored. A weeping Josiah Pike was stripped of his star and shoved into a cell, his authority vanishing as quickly as a puff of gun smoke. Caleb Doolin, silent and sullen, was taken to the infirmary to have his wounds from his fight with Nantan tended before being locked away to await a federal circuit judge. Justice had begun, but it was a slow, grinding machine. The days that followed were a blur of depositions and official statements. Marshal Thompson, his arm in a sling, proved to be a man of quiet, unshakable integrity. He listened, he wrote, and he ensured that the legal process, so often a tool of the powerful, was now being wielded on behalf of the wronged. Maggie spent hours recounting her story, her telegrapher's mind for detail proving invaluable. She described the blonde hair and whiskey breath of the fake raider, the deliberately severed wires, the contents of the ledger, and the final, desperate confrontation on the train. Amos Finch's newspaper became the voice of this unfolding truth. He did not write with sensationalism, but with a steady, damning clarity. He printed excerpts from the ledger. He published interviews with the passengers from the train who had witnessed the fire and the heroism of Nantan and Isaiah. He told the story of the well in Redemption Gulch, slowly, painstakingly. He was dismantling the myth of the savage Apache and replacing it with the complex, uncomfortable truth of a conspiracy fueled by greed. The town of Tucson was a community at war with itself. The old prejudices died hard. There were still whispers in the saloons, men who insisted Baines had been framed, that the whole affair was a trick. Cold stares followed Nantan wherever he went. Yet, For every hostile glance, there was now a hesitant nod, a look of dawning respect. People had seen him save a child. They had seen him choose to bind a defeated enemy rather than kill him. He had shown more lawfulness than the town's own sheriff. The simple, brutal narrative was no longer enough. The true test came a week later. Maggie and Nantan walked down the main street, on their way to meet with the marshal. The midday sun was hot, and Maggie suggested they get a cool drink at the hotel restaurant, a place with shaded tables and glasses of cold lemonade. As they stepped inside, the proprietor, a man with a thick neck and a thicker expression of disapproval, moved to block their path. "We do not serve his kind here," the man said, his eyes fixed on Nantan. The restaurant, sparsely populated with midday diners, fell silent. Every eye turned toward them. Maggie felt a familiar surge of cold anger, but she did not raise her voice. She simply looked the man in the eye, her gaze unwavering. "Then you will not be serving me either," she said, her voice calm and clear. "We will take our business elsewhere. But know this, when the story of what happened here is written, you will be remembered as the man who turned away the person who saved this territory from a tyrant, all because you were too blind to see the hero standing in front of you." She took Nantan's arm, a gesture both of affection and public defiance. She did not storm out. She turned and walked away with a quiet dignity that was more damning than any shout could have been. As they left, she heard one of the diners say, quite clearly, "For shame, Henry, for shame." The wall of belief was cracking, one small act of conscience at a time. The most critical battle, however, was not fought in the court of public opinion, but in a dusty, sun-baked office behind the courthouse. There, a negotiation began, one that would determine the future of Nantan's people. The territorial representative, a pragmatic politician named Judge Alastair Blackwood, sat at the head of a long table. With him were Marshal Thompson and Amos Finch, who was there to act as an official observer. On the other side sat Nantan. Isaiah Reed was at his side, not as a translator of language, but as a translator of cultures, a bridge between two worlds. The central issue was the one that had started it all, land and water. Baines had been trying to drive the Chiricahua off their ancestral lands precisely because those lands contained the headwaters of the San Pedro River, the only reliable water source for miles. With the Apache gone and declared hostile, Baines would have had free rein to dam the river and divert the water entirely to his mining operations, leaving the growing settlements downstream, including Redemption Gulch, at his mercy. "Mr. Baines's crimes are clear," Judge Blackwood began, his fingers steepled, "but that does not solve the underlying problem. The demand for water in this territory is only going to grow. We need a permanent, legal solution." Nantan listened, his face impassive. When the judge was finished, he spoke, his voice low and steady, with Isaiah offering clarification where needed. He did not speak of ancient rites or spiritual claims. He spoke of practicalities. He spoke of how his people had managed the water for generations, never taking more than they needed, ensuring the river flowed for all. He spoke of the balance of the land. The negotiations were difficult, stretching over several days. There was mistrust on both sides, but a new, fragile respect was being forged. Judge Blackwood, who had expected to deal with a warlord, found instead a statesman, Nantan, who had never had reason to trust the white man's law, found in the marshal and the judge a willingness to listen, to seek a genuine peace rather than a mere surrender. The solution they finally reached was a compromise, imperfect but revolutionary for its time. A portion of the Apache lands would be formally recognized by the territorial government, protected from encroachment. In exchange, a formal agreement would guarantee that a significant and consistent portion of the river's flow would be allowed to continue downstream. To ensure this, a new irrigation channel would be built. It would be a joint project. The symbol became the reality a month later. After the first legal proceedings against Baines had concluded, Nantan, Isaiah, and Maggie returned to the outskirts of Redemption Gulch, where Nantan's people had made a new, temporary camp. They were met not by a mob, but by a small delegation of townsfolk, led by the engineer from the train and the mother of the boy Nantan had saved from the well. They began to dig, under the hot Arizona sun. Apache and settler worked side by side. They used shovels and picks in their bare hands. They sweated together. They shared water from the same canteens. And they slowly, painstakingly, carved a new channel into the dry earth. It was a small ditch, only a few feet wide, but it represented a monumental shift. It was water that would flow both ways, a promise of shared life in a land that was harsh enough to demand cooperation. One evening, as the first stars began to appear, their small group of friends gathered by a quiet bend in the new channel. Rosa and Mateo were there, along with Isaiah, the old man from the canyon, and his granddaughter. They built a small, smokeless fire. It was not a celebration. It was a remembrance. They spoke of Nali Awan, of her strength, her quiet humor, her fierce love for her people and her family. They shared stories, painting a portrait of her in words, keeping her spirit alive in their memories. Maggie listened, her heart aching with a grief that felt both personal and universal. She felt a profound connection to the sister she had never known, the woman whose sacrifice had helped pave the way for this fragile peace. She reached up and touched the braided horsehair tie that she had worn in her own hair since the day of the funeral. It felt like a part of her now. The blue bead was a small, bright point of color, a tiny star in the twilight. She looked at Nantan, who was staring into the fire, his face etched with sorrow and memory. She moved to his side, her shoulder brushing his. The others, sensing the intimacy of the moment, grew quiet. "I will tell our children about her," Maggie said, her voice a soft promise in the stillness. "I will tell them how brave she was. They will know her name. They will know her story." Nantan turned to look at her, his dark eyes shimmering in the firelight. He saw the hair tie, the symbol of his sister, woven into the hair of the woman he loved. He saw the past and the future converging in this single, perfect moment. The pain of his loss was still there, a stone he would always carry. But now, it was a stone upon which a new life, a new family, could be built. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. He did not need to speak. His touch said everything, in the quiet solidarity of their small, chosen family. By the side of the water that now promised life for all, they began the slow, difficult, and beautiful work of healing. The high, clear sound of a blacksmith's hammer striking steel was the new heartbeat of the valley. It rang out from a sturdy, open-air forge, a rhythm of creation that had replaced the sound of gunshots and angry shouts. A few years had passed. The raw, desperate edge of Redemption Gulch had been sanded down, not by time alone, but by 1,000 small, deliberate choices made every day. Next to the smithy, where Nantan Lobo's powerful arms shaped glowing metal into horseshoes and plowshares, stood a small, neat schoolhouse. From its open windows in the afternoon came a different kind of music, the sound of children's voices reciting their multiplication tables, a chaotic but hopeful chorus. This was Maggie's domain. The two buildings stood side by side, a testament in wood and adobe to the bridge they had built between their worlds. The town had not been miraculously transformed into a paradise. Prejudice still lingered in the shadows, like the chill in a deep canyon. But the water from the shared channel flowed freely, and with it had come a grudging, then a growing understanding. Men who brought their plows to be mended by the Apache chief could not so easily hate him. Women who saw their children learning to read and write under the patient tutelage of his wife could not so easily fear her. Their small family of allies had found its place. Rosa Martinez, her wisdom and skill finally given the respect they deserved, had opened a proper midwife's clinic in a small house with a clean, whitewashed porch. She was the first person a new life met upon entering the world, a fitting role for a woman of such quiet, life-affirming strength. Isaiah Reed, his conscience finally at peace. had taken a position as a deputy postal clerk. The man who had once followed orders now sorted and delivered the truth, his steady hand ensuring the lines of communication, once so easily severed, remained open and honest. The truest symbol of the new world they were building was a small girl of 4, with her mother's bright, intelligent eyes and her father's long, raven black hair. Her name was Louisa. She was a child of 2 languages, slipping between the soft, guttural sounds of the Apache tongue and the crisp cadence of English without a thought. She was a creature of 2 worlds, equally at home weaving through the dusty clutter of the smithy as she was sitting on a small stool in the schoolhouse, her small finger tracing the letters in a book. One afternoon, she was with her father, her small face smudged with soot, watching him with solemn concentration. He was teaching her the names of his tools in the Chiricahua language, his deep voice soft and patient. She repeated each word carefully, her small brow furrowed in concentration. Then, hearing the sound of the schoolhouse door opening, she broke into a wide smile and ran, her small legs churning up the dust. "Mama," she cried, a word that needed no translation. Maggie came out onto the schoolhouse porch, wiping her chalk-dusty hands on her apron. She smiled as Louisa ran into her arms, lifting the girl and kissing her smudged cheek. She looked over at Nantan, who had paused in his work, leaning on his hammer. The fierce warrior, the stoic chief, now looked at his wife and child, and the love in his eyes was a fire far brighter than the one in his forge. They had built a life here, in the space between the hammer and the book, between the old ways and the new. It was a life of constant, conscious effort, of choosing understanding over fear, every single day. Their family was the bridge, and Louisa was the proof that it was strong enough to bear the weight of the future. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, Isaiah rode up on his postal route. He had a letter for Maggie, and a copy of the Tucson Chronicle, now a few days old, that he had saved for them. He dismounted, accepting a dipper of cool water from Nantan and exchanging a few quiet words. They were more than allies now. They were brothers, forged in a fire that had tested them all. Later, as the evening settled, the family sat on the porch of their small, sturdy house, which stood on a gentle rise overlooking both the town and the Apache camp. The air was cool and smelled of juniper smoke and the dust settling after a long, hot day. Louisa sat between them, her head leaning against her father's leg, half asleep. Maggie unfolded the newspaper. The story was on the front page, the final chapter of a long and painful saga. She read it aloud, her voice clear and steady in the twilight. Amos Finch's prose was, as always, direct and unflinching. Silas Baines, after a long and exhaustive federal trial, had been found guilty on all counts: conspiracy, incitement to riot, mail fraud, and accessory to murder. His appeals were exhausted. He would spend the rest of his life in a federal prison in a distant, colder part of the country, a place with no silver mines and no sky the color of a furnace. His name, once a symbol of power and fear, was now just a footnote in a story about justice. When she finished reading, a profound silence settled over the porch. The ghosts of the past, of William, of Nolly, of the fear and the violence, seemed to finally recede, to find their peace in this quiet, final verdict. The war was truly over. Maggie folded the newspaper and set it aside. She looked at Louisa, her heart swelling with a love so fierce it almost hurt. She thought of Nolly, and the promise she had made by a stream in a canyon of ashes. This child, this beautiful, brave child of 2 worlds, would know her story. She would carry the past with her, not as a burden, but as a source of strength. Nantan reached out and took her hand. His palm was calloused and warm, the hand of a man who worked and fought and protected. She laced her fingers through his, their familiar touch a silent language of love and shared history. He looked out at the horizon, where the last sliver of the sun was sinking behind the dark, jagged peaks of the mountains. "Anywhere close to forever," he said, his voice a low, soft rumble. "Still has room for tomorrow." She squeezed his hand, a smile touching her lips. He was right. Their forever was not a destination they had reached. It was the road they walked together, every day. A road that always had room for another sunrise, another challenge, another small, perfect moment of peace. Later that night, long after Louisa was asleep and the moon had risen high over the valley, Maggie sat at her small writing desk, a single lamp casting a warm pool of light on the page of her journal. She dipped her pen in the ink, the faint scratching sound the only noise in the quiet house. "We did not change the West," she wrote. "The mountains are still as unforgiving, the sun is still as fierce, and the hearts of some men are still as hard as the rock they covet. We did not change the West. We just decided not to let the West change us in the worst way." Thank you for listening to this story. Please comment below with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to my channel Wild West Tales. Like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story in the video can be heard by more people.